So a few years ago, this is a long time ago, this was before I had kids, Lindsay and I had bought our first house. I was doing some landscape work around the house, and I ordered a load of dirt. And I ordered it from a specific guy. I had a friend who was in the landscaping business, and I ordered it from this specific guy who had this great reputation for having the best topsoil out there, and he screened his soil. And so, I ordered it from this guy. I never met the guy, but he brought it to my house, and it was a $300 load of dirt. It was a huge double axle dump truck load of dirt. And $300 was a lot of money for me at the time. But we really needed this dirt to do what we needed to do at our house. So I ordered that load of dirt, showed up at my house, backed down the driveway, dumps the load of dirt there, and he gets out. And that's the first time I've met the guy. And so we start talking. He says, I need to write you up a ticket. What's your name? So I told him my name is Derek Allen. He said, Allen. He said, are you related to Elmer? And I said, yes, Elmer was my grandfather. And he said, your granddaddy was a good man. And he said, your granddaddy sold me my first dump truck. He said, years ago, I was getting into doing a little bit of this business. And he said, your granddaddy sold me my first dump truck. And he said, you know what? Your granddaddy told me. He said, that day I bought it. He said, this is a good truck. He said, I've fixed it up. everything's good with it. And he said, but look, if it's not everything you thought it should be, then you bring it back and I'll give you your money back. He said, I drove that truck off. And he said, I used that truck for 2 or 3 weeks. And there was really nothing wrong with it. Everything was good with it. It just, as your granddaddy said, wasn't everything I thought it was going to be. So I drove it back over to his house. And I said, I really am not satisfied with the truck. It's not everything I thought it would be. And he said, he didn't ask a question. He pulled the money right back out that I gave to him. And he gave me every dollar for dollar for that truck. And he said, don't worry about it. And he said, that was the first dump truck I bought from him. I bought several from him. I bought several backhoes from him. He said, your granddaddy was a good man. And then he said, and your money's no good. He said, this load's on me. He said, if you need more, I'll let you pay for that one. But he said, you're not paying for this load of dirt. He said, this is what he told me. He said, your grandfather paid for this load of dirt. And man, I knew my grandfather was a good man. My grandfather was a godly man. He was a man who kept his word. So many people in the little town that I grew up in knew who he was, and he had that kind of reputation. And that was a day that was a different day in our nation, a day where people did keep their word, and that was common. That was considered just par for the course. That's what people did. They kept their word. But here's the thing: wouldn't it be a better world? And we kind of have some nostalgia about it. Like we wish we could go back to that time. We can't go back. You can never go back. We can go forward, but we can't go back. And there may come a day again. God did it first, and it wasn't that we were better human beings at the time. It wasn't that somehow we just figured things out on our own. No, that was a work of God that he had done in a particular group of people at a particular time. That can happen again. Even though we're headed into a time where it seems to be the opposite of that, the Lord can, in his time and in his way, bring that kind of world back. And wouldn't it be a better world? We kind of all wish we lived in a world like that. Why? Because that's the way the Lord intended us to live. That's the world God intended us to live in. It's reflected in this passage that we're going to read here. And here's what I want us to see in the passage. What I want us to take away is this. Self-righteousness requires deception, but true righteousness loves the truth. So self-righteousness requires deception. You can't be self-righteous. You can't fake righteousness without being deceptive. So deception's kind of baked into the cake of self-righteousness. And we're talking about the difference in what it looks like to have the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, which was a self-righteousness, and then true righteousness that Jesus is teaching about in the Sermon on the Mount. And so deception is just part of the game for self-righteousness. You have to pretend to be somebody you're not in order to be self-righteousness. But true righteousness loves the truth. Well, let's read the passage together. I'm going to start in verse 33 and read through verse 37. Jesus says, again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. Self-righteousness requires deception, but true righteousness loves the truth. Well, let's walk through this passage one step at a time. Talk first about the original commandment. All these commandments up to this point have been something from the Hebrew Scriptures, and either it is something that was misunderstood, or something that was misapplied, or something that was correctly understood, but there was more to it. So we had, you shall not murder, and Jesus said, okay, that's still true. Murder's still wrong, but you've misunderstood that there's something deeper. You've not gone deep enough with that. Then he said, you shall not commit adultery. Still true, still a commandment, but you've misunderstood there's a different kind of adultery you can commit, and you've not gone deeply enough with that command. Then we looked at the command on divorce, where they took a command really meant to preserve marriage, and they twisted it to be like a loophole to easily get out of marriage. And Jesus says, this is a command from God, and you've taken it and you've really messed this command up. So now we're looking at this idea that you shall not swear falsely, but will perform what you said you'll do. You'll do what you said you do. Well, there's certainly nothing wrong with doing what you said you were going to do, but Jesus really takes this moment to say, you've taken this command that was meant to accomplish one thing, and as we'll see in a moment, they really twisted this command. I mean, really, honestly, this command, of all the commands that we study in this passage, this is one of those commands where I think, I can't believe you actually were able to twist it that far in order to kind of provide the way, pave the way for your own wickedness. So we'll see what we mean as we unpack this. So what's the original command? The original command is you shall not swear falsely. It is an Old Testament command. It's not just an Old Testament command. I mean, it's something your mama tells you, do what you say you're going to do. Don't go out there and make false promises. I think that is pretty standard, but it is clear in the Old Testament. Leviticus 19:12, you shall not swear by my name falsely, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Numbers 30, chapter 30, verse 2, if a man vows a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. Do what you said you were going to do in both Leviticus and Numbers. So what does it mean to swear? We might hear the word swear and think that it means to curse or something like that. That's not actually what it means. I have given you a definition there that I think is a pretty good definition. It's to affirm the truth of a statement while calling on God to judge you if it is in fact untrue. So it's saying, if this is not true, then I want God to be my judge. There was a boy I went to school with in elementary school, and by the grace and mercy of God, the Lord did not strike him dead. Because he would say this all the time. He would raise his hand and he would say, may the Lord strike me dead if I'm lying. Now, here's what, it didn't take you very long to learn something. You know what the next words out of his mouth were? A lie. No matter what he said next, it was going to be a lie. In fact, that was his indicator that he was about to lie. And so, that's what we're talking about when we say, I'm going to swear an oath. I'm going to invoke the name of God in order to say that if I'm not telling the truth, then God be my judge. So that's what we're talking about. Jesus says, hey, let's just don't do that at all. The purpose of the passages that we read in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, if you look back at them and read them carefully, you'll see the purpose is, or the focus at least, is not about swearing oaths, it's about keeping them. So it's not about making them, it's about keeping them. In both of those passages, it's not putting the emphasis on making the oath, it's saying if you make an oath, you need to keep the oath. In other words, if you vow it, do it. If you say it, do it. Not, if you really want to make something serious, make a vow or swear an oath. And that's kind of what was going on in the first century. Well, if I'm going to say something serious, if I'm going to say something of weight, then I'm going to make sure I attach an oath or a vow to it. So what God says in the Old Testament is, hey, if you make the vow, go through with the vow. By the time we roll around to the New Testament, they've contorted that to say, anything you say that's serious, you better attach a vow to it. And that's what Jesus is speaking against, especially when we take into account what they were actually doing with these oaths. So let's go into the full commandment. What's the full commandment? Jesus says, just don't take an oath at all. Just don't take an oath. So instead of taking the oath and then violating God's original intent for the oath, just don't take the oath at all. That means it's always wrong to take an oath or a vow? No. We have evidence in the New Testament of some vows and some oaths, and I have given you one there in Galatians 1:20, where it's really this setup, where Paul says, in what I am writing to you before God, I do not lie. It's not the only time Paul says something like this. But he says, look, I want you to know before the Lord that what I'm telling you is the truth. Well, this is similar to what Jesus is talking about here in this passage. So it's not that we should never make an oath, that we should never make a vow, that if we're called to testify in court, that we should say, I won't put my hand on the Bible and say that what I'm going to say is the truth, or that we shouldn't take an oath in the military or anything like that. But we should be careful about our intentions with oaths, and we should not fall into the same trap that they were falling to in the first century, where the Pharisees had perverted the entire command surrounding the swearing of oaths. Instead of, if you make an oath, keep it, they looked for ways, think about how wicked this is. They looked for ways that they could make an oath they did not have to keep. So you remember as a kid, what did you do if you wanted to say something, but you didn't really want to do it? Cross your fingers. Now, and then you cross your fingers and put them behind your back. All right? This is what the Pharisees were doing. They would say, well, I promise I would, oh, you know what? I had my fingers crossed. You know, that's fun when you're 8 years old. But when you're an adult, and when you're a teacher, when you're a scribe or a Pharisee, and you're a teacher of the law, and you're holding people to all these standards of righteousness, but you're crossing your fingers and getting out of your own oaths on a technicality, then that's wicked to a really deep level. And that's what the Pharisees were doing. So you can see it in Jesus' own words. So they reasoned that by swearing by something other than God and God's name, that was less serious, so they could then break the oath. So what does the Hebrew Scripture say? If you swear an oath in my name, then you better keep the oath. So what would they do? They'd say, well, we're not going to swear in God's name because God commanded that if we swear in His name, we need to keep that. So we're going to swear by heaven. So I swear by heaven. That's not God's name, so I'm okay to break my oath. Or I'm going to swear by earth, or I'm going to swear by Jerusalem, or I'm going to swear by my own head. We don't know that they actually swore by their own heads. That may just be Jesus pressing a little further to make the point. But people did swear by heaven, by earth, and by Jerusalem. We have records of, extra biblical records of them making these incredible oaths and swearing by heaven. And their logic was, well, I won't be judged as harshly for breaking this oath because I didn't actually swear in the name of God. I swore by heaven. Well, what does Jesus say? Jesus says this is foolish. Heaven is God's home. Earth is God's footstool. Jerusalem is God's city. And you can't even by any power make one hair on your head gray or dark. You know, and this is before hair coloring, so we understand what Jesus means here. That like you don't own your own head. You can't do anything. You have no power over your own body. That actually belongs to the Lord. And so when you're swearing by your own body, you know, this belongs to the Lord too. So in effect, you're still swearing by something that is attached to God's name. So you're not in any way released from the seriousness of the vow. I have a pretty long passage that I wrote, put there in your listening guide in Matthew 23, because I think when you see this, you'll see what was going on here. Jesus gives us some other examples of what they were doing. So starting in Matthew 23, verse 16, he says, "Woe to you, blind guides." He's speaking to the Pharisees. He says, "If anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he's bound by his oath." So he says, which is greater, the gold or the temple? And it's the temple that's made the gold sacred. And then he says, if you swear by the altar, it is nothing. You say it's nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift that is on the altar, then he is bound by his oath. Let me tell you what they were doing here. They were saying, well, I swear by the temple. I swear by the temple that I will do such and such in this way. And then, a couple weeks goes by, they don't do such and such in this way. And you come back to them and you say, hey, you swore by the temple. You know what they would say? Well, by all means, go collect the temple. There's no way to collect the temple. You can't put a lien on the temple. The temple's not going to pay you. You can't in any way hold anything against the temple. They would say, well, you know what? By all means, I did. I swore by the temple. So you go down to the temple and you tell them to give you the temple, and we'll be fair. But if they swore by the gold of the temple, then they could say, well, there's so much gold in the temple, and so we can't get the temple gold, but you owe me that much gold. Or if you swore by the altar, well, by all means, go collect the altar from the temple. We have extra biblical records of people doing this. Well, I swore by the altar, so by all means, go get the altar from the temple. But now if you swear by the sacrifice that's on the altar, let's say it's a bull, well, then you owe that person a bull. So Jesus says the wickedness here, the depth of wickedness, it really is making a serious statement about something, crossing your fingers and saying, well, you didn't know my fingers were crossed behind my back. So it's a way to deceive people. It's a way to skirt your way out of your obligations. It's a way not to keep your word. So what does Jesus say we should do about this? He says, look, don't even take oaths at all. Just let your yes be yes and your no be no. Why do you need to pile on all these important oaths if what you intend, what you say is exactly what you intend to do? There is no need for elaborate oaths if you intend to do what you said. In fact, an oath doesn't really indicate that something is more likely true. An oath indicates that something is hard to believe. So an oath indicates that something is likely to be false. I had another friend in school, and he was a great storyteller. Now, none of them were true, but we loved to take him on camping trips or road trips or whatever because, man, he could tell a story like nobody's business. And I'll never forget, the first night he and I went camping, I went to a new school, and I'm meeting these new friends. He invites me to go camping. I love to go camping. So we're out camping in his backyard, and he said, man, he said, look, tomorrow we're going to have a lot of fun. He said, I have a hovercraft. I said, you have a hovercraft? He said, yeah. And then he said it. He said, I ain't kidding you. I ain't kidding you. And I said, you serious? I said, where is this hovercraft? I said, he said, it's right down there in the barn. I mean, we were 20 yards from the barn. He said, we keep it right down there in the barn. We'll get it out tomorrow, ride it around. I said, how did you get a hovercraft? He said, my cousin, Shannon. He said, oh, man, he has a hovercraft, and he keeps it down here. And, you know, he's got a lot of money, and he bought himself a hovercraft, but he doesn't have any place to keep it. So he keeps it here, and he lets me ride it whenever I want to. Oh, man, this is going to be amazing. I went to sleep that night just dreaming about riding this hovercraft. So we got up the next morning, and, I mean, the first thing I want to do, I don't want to eat breakfast. The sun's up now. I want to go see this hovercraft. And so we walked down to the barn. Man, he's talking this hovercraft up the whole way. I mean, he is sold out to the idea that there's a hovercraft. We get down there, we open the door, no hovercraft. And he never missed a beat. He said, Shannon must have come and gotten it. And I knew right then, man, he got me. You know, fool me once, right? But we kept him around. I mean, he was a good friend of mine, actually, and we did a lot of things together. And you could always tell when he was about to tell a good story because he'd say, I ain't kidding you. And you know what? When he said that, boy, I mean, you know what? Your ears perk up. You go, man, I cannot wait to see what he's about to tell us now, because you could guarantee two things. Number one, it was going to be a lie. Number two, it was going to be really entertaining. So, you know, when you put an oath on something, it's actually an indication that there's some reason to think that it might be false. Why would you need to go over the top to convince somebody of something that is actually true? So let your yes be yes and your no be no. You know, for some really practical application of this, think of parenting. You can approach parenting one of two ways. You can approach parenting by being over the top, yelling, I am in charge, you will do what I say. And in some ways you can get the kids to do what you're going to say, what you say that they need to do. But we all know it's scary when mom gets upset, right? It's scary when mom's like, I tell you what, some things are going to change around here, whatever, whatever. But now Lindsay never does that. For a record, I'm on camera right here. I would like to say Lindsay never does that. But it's much scarier when you walk in and you know that you've done something and you know mom knows about it and she's real quiet. You know, it's much scarier. What is she thinking? What is going to happen here? Like, let your yes be yes and your no be no. You don't need to add on all that stuff. In fact, in parenting, I struggle with this too. I stand up here as a parent telling you this is a struggle for me. But if you can sit down and speak to your children, and your children will do what you've told them to do, then you have authority and control over your children. If you have to stand up and get loud and, do whatever to get your children to do what you need them to do, that's not really authority. And so in parenting, what you want to do is move from that kind to the other kind, where you get to the point where you say, you know what, I'm going to sit down. We try to do that as often as we can with our children, and just, okay, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to explain to you how things are going to go. I love you, but here are the consequences for what you've done. I'm not upset with you, and I'm not in any way. It doesn't change the fact that I love you, but this is how things are going to be because of this. And if you want this to change, then here are the steps you can take to change your behavior in the future so that this will change. And so that's just simply let your yes be yes and your no be no. I think we all knew as kids, and don't think our kids don't know it, we all knew as kids when no meant no and when no meant maybe. Now I'll tell you, with my mom, no was no, and like to go any further down that road was to endanger your personal freedom. I mean, it was just not wise to go down that road. But we do learn, there's certain cues we pick up on from our parents. And so in parenting, this is actually for our benefit. If we wouldn't swear an oath. We wouldn't say, by the temple in Jerusalem, if you don't have your room clean, we wouldn't do that. But we do come up with all kind of additions to put onto those things. We would do this also in business. I'll tell you what, if you don't come through with this business deal, and you just pile on stuff. But if you're a businessman or businesswoman who has a reputation that your yes is yes and your no is no, then you don't need all that extra stuff added on. Application for marriage. If your spouse knows that you're a man or woman of your yes is yes and your no is no, then it removes a lot of need for emotion from the situation. So there's so much application to this. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Honest character is always better than a passionate oath. Honest character is always better than a passionate oath. By the way, if you're reading through the Bible this year, if you're following the Bible reading plan, you'll come across a lot of these oaths. People will make these over-the-top oaths. By the end of the day, the sun will not set before I have done this or that. And you'll see these oaths, and those weren't necessarily the same kind of perversion of the oaths that the scribes and Pharisees had, but you see that oath-making culture that was present there in biblical times that Jesus is addressing. So this doesn't mean that we as Christians should disconnect from all oath-taking, and that if we're going in the military, we should refuse to take the oath, or if we go down to the courthouse, we should refuse to put our hand on the Bible and take an oath to be honest. But it does mean that we should be men and women of honest character, and that honest character should stand in the place of our need to take some kind of elaborate oath. That's the way God designed the world to work. The world is broken. The world is dark. The world does not live this way. But we're to be lights in the dark place, and we're to be what the world looks at and says, this would be a much better world if the world were this way.